Okay, context effects and the serial position effect. So the thing that you need to know here is encoding specificity. Your memory is absolutely going to be best when the cues at study and test match. That is Endel Tolving's major contribution, or one of them. He was a pretty big deal in cognitive psychology. But he presented this as a law. Memory retrieval is dependent upon a match between the cues present at the time of retrieval and attributes that are stored as part of the memory representation. So you need good retrieval cues to be able to recall something effectively. And that hiccups after having my coffee. We can see these effects in something like state-dependent learning. Now, this is one of my favorite studies because Baddeley and Hitch both wanted to learn how to dive, and they figured out a way of making the university pay for it. This would never happen these days. But what they did was get the university to pay for lessons so that they could get the group to study underwater versus on land, and then they'd be able to test how well participants did. And they demonstrated this great context effect. When participants were presented with the words for studying, either underwater or on land, their performance depended on where they were tested. So they did best when there was a match. So as you can see here, if participants were underwater at study, they did best on a test when they were underwater for the test. If they studied the words initially on land, then they did better when they were tested on land. Context matters. A great example of the encoding specificity effect. It's also somewhat true for mood, okay, so state-dependent learning. Some of the results around these studies are iffy now, but this particular experiment has been replicated. Iker and Metcalf, and what they did was have participants listen to melancholic or merry music, and then so they get them into a happy or a sad mood, and they tested that to make sure that that was effective, and then have them study a set of words, and then they were tested on their memory 2 days later. And again, they did best when the learning and study context was the same. So happy music at study, they did best when they were presented with happy music at test. Sad music at study, best when they were given sad music at test. So people do best when their memory matches, when their mood matches the study and test conditions. So you could take that to an extreme by saying that if you get anxious for tests, you should get anxious for study, and then you'll be matching your tests. Instead, I would try and suggest that you try and figure out a way of calming yourself for the test. In this case, because you're going to be taking your tests in the same environment as you're studying properly. So you make use of all of that, and make sure that your mood and entire frame is as consistent as possible. Okay, now the serial position effect is a really enduring phenomenon. And again, I would have loved to have given you a demonstration of this effect here. Instead, again, I would ask that you give a sibling or friend the test and see if they demonstrate it. So these are the words that I would ask you to recall. Okay, so I'll give you a second to write them down. It's a serial position effect test, which means that you only get credit when you remember the word in the right order. So if you're going to test a sibling, a parent, a friend, you read the word, wait 2 seconds, read the next word, and then at the end, wait 2 seconds after train, and then tell them to write all of the words down. And then this is numbered through 12, and they get diamond right only if it's in the first spot. Now, what you are likely to find, and let's just assume you all do it and follow my directions, this is what you should find. You should find a primacy effect and a recency effect. So participants should do really well with the first couple of words. That is, they should remember diamond and computer. And then they should do really well with the last words, table and train. So that's a recency effect. Now, why do we see these two effects? And it's reliable. It almost always happens. We see the primacy effect because it's encoding effect, maintenance rehearsal. They're the first words that you say, so they get rehearsed the most. The recency effect we see because that's a short-term memory effect. What people tend to do is dump down on paper the last words that they heard before they forget them. So that means that they're recalled at a really high rate. Now, we can also eliminate some of these effects and demonstrate in more effectively. If I gave you longer between each word, so instead of 3 seconds, I extended it to 6 seconds, you'll see a better recall overall. You'll still see the same pattern, but people will be more likely to remember more of the words. That's allowing more rehearsal time. But if I wait 20 seconds, 30 seconds at the end of the words before people are allowed to write them down, you will eliminate the recency effect. It will be gone because you're preventing people from just using the rehearsal strategy of getting those words out. Now, serial position effects are everywhere in our world. They exist in infants, in juries, on Alzheimer's patients. We'll talk more about that in a later topic. And when we're told the next one is going to be the last one, we like it more, okay? I use that with my daughter all the time. And it's also demonstrated in the humor response. So juries, I want you to think about this, and obviously we're interested in forensic psychology. You think of it as pre-decisional distortion. So people make a judgment about a case very early, and the early information that they get is prosecution. So we can see this serial position effect even in our justice system. We also see it in our humor response. So we become sensitized and things are funnier, which has implications for comedians. So if you have a bunch of material as a comedian and you're trying to structure your comedy act, you know that you want to make the most of the primacy and the recency effect. You probably have some material that's not that great, but you know that you want people to leave and talk about how funny you were. So you have to give them some really funny stuff at the start to make use of their rehearsal. It's the things that they're most likely to remember. And your really funny stuff at the end, because that's the most likely thing that they'll talk about as they're going away, which means that you would put your unfunny stuff in the middle. Because we're becoming sensitized as we go, that means that that stuff isn't going to be as bad as it would be if it was just a single joke. So for all your comedians in this class, you're welcome. Now we can also disrupt the serial position effect and via the von Restorff effect or the next in line effect. Now the von Restorff effect is a surprising word. It's also sometimes known as an isolation effect. But if I gave you a list of vegetables or fruits and threw in Madonna, something that you were not expecting, it would throw off the serial position and people would remember it really well, probably at 100% of the time, okay? Because it doesn't fit the pattern, it's going to stand out. It's a release from proactive interference. The next in line effect is kind of a fun one that relies a lot on social cognition. So in this study, participants were seated in a circle and they were given a word that they had to say out loud. So all it is a public speaking task. So they've got a word and they just have to wait until they're next and then say it out loud. And then they were asked to recall all the words. What they found was that participants did not do very well at all in recalling the word that was immediately prior to them and immediately after them. Why? Well, I don't know if you know this, but public speaking is considered to be the highest anxiety producer for most people. So it's the fear of having to say your word next and getting it wrong meant that people weren't encoding what was said immediately prior to them. And they didn't recall the one next out of sheer relief that they'd done okay. So that's the next in line effect. Now you can also actually, this is kind of fun, see a vicarious peak effect for couples. So in this particular study, couples who had been together for more than 6 months were recruited together, and then they were seated in kind of opposite each other, and then they did the same kind of task. So they were given a word that they had to present. And what the researchers demonstrated was a vicarious peak effect. So people would freak out for themselves that they had to say their word, and then that meant that they wouldn't recall it, and then they'd freak out for their partner as well and worry that they were going to muck it up. Now, that the size of the peak effect actually corresponded to the likelihood that the couple was still together 6 months later. So the couple that weren't worried at all, they were not together. Now, I don't recommend using this as a test for your current relationship, but it's amusing.